Hey everyone, I'm Ben Norton, and this is Multipolarista. Today I'm joined by a good friend of mine, Brian Mier, who's an excellent journalist. He's been living in Brazil for decades, and he works with Telesur and also Brazil Wire. Brazil Wire is probably the best English language resource to get reporting on Brazil. And today, of course, we're talking about the historic victory of Lula da Silva in the presidential elections, the second round on October 30th. Lula won with 50.9% of the vote, and he defeated the far-right incumbent president, Jair Bolsonaro, who got 49.1%. That means that Lula got 2.1 million more votes than Jair Bolsonaro. So it was pretty close. However, this is the first time since the restoration of democracy after the dictatorship was installed by the US and it was overthrown in the 1980s, that this is the first time that an incumbent president has been defeated. So Lula made history, not only by defeating Bolsonaro, but even though it looks like it's a very close race, this is actually the first time that a president has accomplished this. And in his speech, his victory speech, Lula called for ending poverty and ending hunger. He said his top priority will be making sure that every Brazilian has breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He said it's ridiculous in a country that exports food that there are 30 million people hungry. He said that homeless people who live under bridges need to be given houses. He said that he wants to provide jobs for poor people to fight poverty. He wants to expand education and ensure women's equality. It was a very ambitious victory speech in which he really showed that Lula is a man of the people. He's a supporter of the working class. Lula himself comes from a very poor background. He lived in a rural, underdeveloped area that didn't have electricity and clean water. And he's, of course, from the left-wing Workers' Party. Now, there are a lot of things to talk about today, and Brian is the best guest to talk about this with. For instance, we know that the Workers' Party coalition that it formed with the Communist Party and the Green Party, it does not have a majority in either of the chambers of the Congress. So Lula is going to have obstacles, but he's used to those obstacles. He never had a majority when he was in office the first two terms in the early 2000s. We're going to talk about what this means for Brazilian politics. And then, of course, at the show, I focus a lot on geopolitics, on international politics. So we're going to discuss what this means for the BRICS system. Brazil is, of course, the B in BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And Lula da Silva himself was one of the co-founders of the BRICS system. A few days before the election, he called for expanding the BRICS to add Argentina and other countries. And he's also called for strengthening organizations of regional unity, like the CELAC, like UNASUR, like Mercosur. So this is going to be a game changer. That's why I call this episode a game changer for the region and really for the world, because Lula has called for a multipolar world. He doesn't want Brazil just to be a significant regional power. He understands that Brazil, the seventh most populous country on earth, with 215 million people, with one of the largest economies on earth, it has significant influence and it should play an important role on the international stage. He's called for trying to broker peace in the war in Ukraine, and in general, just calling for peace and stability around the world. He's condemned Washington's new Cold War on China. So that's a very broad overview of the things we want to talk about today. But Brian, let's start with just kind of an overview of what the situation looks like in Brazil. You were out reporting last night. You were in Sao Paulo. You've lived in Brazil for many decades. Talk about what the situation was like on the streets. There are all these people on, Avenida Paulista. I saw hundreds of thousands flooding the streets, celebrating. What are the Brazilian people saying in response to this victory?
Well, first of all, it's important to debunk a few false narratives that I've seen, especially among kind of like U.S. left or academic type self-proclaimed radical leftists, and also through BBC and other media companies. First of all, the vast majority of the people on Paulista Avenue last night, and there were at least 100, maybe 200,000 of them, were from the working class, and many from the working class social movements and labor unions. the working class and the poor voted for Lula at a 2-to-1 ratio over Bolsonaro. Most of Bolsonaro's support, including his evangelical Christian support, is from the petite bourgeois and from the upper middle class and the wealthy, right? The only demographic that Lula continually led the polls in by a huge amount was people from families making less than 2 times the minimum salary. All the other demographic groups supported Bolsonaro. This is important to point out because you see this ongoing effort, especially by the BBC, to portray Bolsonaro's support base being mostly like poor evangelical Christians, evangelicals in favelas, black women evangelicals. Black women were the demographic that most voted for Lula, right? From favelas, from anywhere, right? Including most black women evangelicals voted for Lula. Most evangelical Christians making less than the minimum salary, poor evangelical Christians voted for Lula. So there's this kind of like false imposition of what happened. The same kind of narrative they tried to build with Trump in the U.S., saying that most of Trump's followers were poor. He had the real support of the working class. They tried to say that about Bolsonaro as well, and it's factually inaccurate. So that's an important first thing to point out. A second thing that I've seen circulating, as I said before, among like intellectual American leftists and stuff, is that kind of like the Brazil's so-called real left, begrudgingly supported Lula. And that's another huge misconception. Unless your conception of real left are just people from tiny, self-proclaimed vanguard left political parties that have never elected a single public official, you have this community, this tiny community of like anti-PT leftists, but the actual leftist organizations that do things, for mainly, I'll give a big example, the landless rural workers movement has always been on board with the Workers' Party. The landless rural workers movement, which managed to elect for the first time in its history, 2 people into the federal Congress and 4 people into state Congresses. So this idea that, for example, on Paulista Avenue, both on Saturday, when there was a huge rally with Lula, Pepe Mujica was there on the sound car with Lula and Haddad and Alckmin going down Paulista Avenue. And then last night as well, what I saw on the street were a lot of people from the squatters movements, from the MST, student activists and things like that. And last night was just like a general outpouring of people coming in from all over the city, all sides of the city to just celebrate.
Yeah, this is so crucial to understand why Lula won. He had the working class support. The Workers' Party had that working class support. And you can see this clearly reflected in the victory speech that he gave. I have to say, as someone from the United States, it's always incredible to hear a president, especially the president of a major country like Brazil, dedicate the bulk of their speech to discussing fighting poverty and inequality. In the United States, the richest country on earth, according to bourgeois measurements, which aren't very accurate, but the U.S. has all this wealth, and yet it has a huge number of homeless people that grows every single year. It has millions of people who suffer from hunger in this very wealthy country. Brazil is much less wealthy, although it's the largest economy in Latin America. And we saw that Lula dedicated his speech to saying, my top priority is to end hunger in this country. 30 million Brazilians suffer from hunger. He said that I never imagined to see the skyrocketing growth of poverty in the last few years under Bolsonaro. And he also called for, providing jobs and more education and social programs. So it's no surprise why Lula was very popular. Now, I just want to say, as someone who lives in Nicaragua and Latin America, but a much smaller country, the victory is so significant for the region. People really need to understand that Brazil's population, 215 million, this is the largest, most populous country in Latin America. Basically, if you take the rest of the region and combine it, it's a little bigger than Brazil, but Brazil represents, almost more than half of Latin America. The second biggest country in terms of population is Mexico, which is nearly half the population. So this is a massive victory for the entire region. Talk about how, you mentioned that Pepe Mujica was in Brazil. Talk about how Lula has always been part of this process of Latin American regional unity, and how not only is this important for the Brazilian working class, but for the region as a whole.
Well, the Workers' Party's basically ethos comes out of this tradition from the 1940s and 1950s of developmentalism. It's a kind of economic approach that was pioneered by people like Raul Prebisch at CEPLAC, at the UN agency in Chile in the 1940s and 1950s, that believes in increasing sovereignty, including economic sovereignty, import replacement through stimulus for industry, and South-South collaboration and cooperation with other countries, instead of like focusing on bilateral relationships with the United States, which is what always happens when a dictator or someone from the right comes into power in a Latin American country. Brazil in general has a good record on South-South solidarity. I mean, even among right-wing governments like Fernando Henrique Cardoso, he never, chastised Cuba. He met with Fidel Castro on a few occasions. But I think one of the symbols of Lula's approach to regional integration was when he and Hugo Chavez together, hold on a second, this is my second consecutive stream.
Yeah, I know you're doing a lot of interviews today. Very popular.
He and Hugo Chavez in 2003 defeated the Free Trade Agreement of the Americas, which was an attempt by the United States to make like a giganto NACLA for all of Latin America. It was backed by the Rockefellers. It was backed by ASCOA, which is this big corporate think tank that represents the interests of all the big mining and petroleum and agribusiness companies that pillaged Latin America the entire time. And when he joined together with Hugo Chavez to defeat the FTAA, yeah, that looks like that Cancun maybe? Well, that's a little bit later. That's interesting too, right? I was in the World Social Forum in 2003 in Porto Alegre. Every one of these people spoke there. 2002, before the election even. So like a lot of these, the World Social Forum had a big important role in Latin American integration of the left as well, because I remember like Evo Morales, Rafael Correa, Lula, they all spoke at the World Social Forum before they were elected president. Chavez was there, he was already president. But that's an important, that whole process of the World Social Forum had an important, influence on regional integration as well. And Kirchner, Lula gets criticized, sometimes for not being left enough, right? For not being left enough. But if you look at his political, his international political policies, they're pretty fundamentally important. I mean, he's the founder of the BRICS, right? He didn't just like join BRICS. He helped come up with the idea. BRICS was born out of IBSA, which is something that I actually participated in a few meetings with in India. IBSA was India, Brazil, and South Africa. And then at some point, Lula was like, well, why don't we add China and Russia? With those countries together, you have a very strong alternate, potential for a very strong alternate trade bloc to break the United States, monopoly, to break the United States unipolarity. I can't underestimate how important, I don't know what I'm saying. BRICS is just like, it's so important. Even Bolsonaro didn't abandon BRICS. There's some misunderstandings about, he didn't just like give up on BRICS, but Brazil's gonna move from being a passive actor in the BRICS coalition, which it was under Bolsonaro, just like showing up at the meeting, saying a few nice things. It's going to become a protagonist in BRICS right now. And I think that's really important. You know, it's important that BRICS isn't just a bloc that's like led by China and Russia. It needs the other country members to have strong voices in it. You know, I don't know who's this guy on the left of Lula in this picture.
Medvedev.
Oh, Medvedev. Okay. All right.
Yeah, at the time he was Russian president. No, but
you were anyone from South Africa there.
Well, yeah, I guess this photo is, I don't know if it's cut off. I was just trying to find the full photo. Yeah. But the point is that BRICS was officially formed in 2009 when Lula was president. And we need to stress that point, that Lula himself was one of the creators. It was his vision to help create BRICS. And now he's calling for expanding it. In fact, just a few days before the second round of the election on October 30th, Lula reiterated his call for expanding BRICS, and he said he supports Argentina joining. We also see that Iran wants to join, potentially even Saudi Arabia, potentially Turkey. It's going to continue expanding. And what's also incredible is he reassured his commitment to expanding institutions of regional integration, like the CELAC, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, UNASUR, which is a South American regional bloc. And he also even proposed the idea of creating a pan-Latin American currency to end their dependency on the dollar. So, I mean, if you want to respond briefly to this, Brian, it's kind of so stupid that it's not really worth a response, but there was this kind of like a right-wing Trumpist, kind of like Bannonite propaganda trying to portray Lula as like the Soros left and like supposedly a puppet of the U.S. Democratic Party, which is just completely preposterous considering it was the Obama administration that oversaw the 2016 coup that removed the Workers' Party president Dilma Rousseff from office. And the whole Operation Lava Jato and the coup was set in motion by the Obama Justice Department. I mean, maybe you can respond to this ridiculous narrative that like Lula is Soros left controlled opposition or whatever.
It's just fantasy projection. It has nothing to do with reality. These people don't even understand Brazil or how Brazil works. It's just a joke. I mean, you look at, all right, 3 days after Dilma Rousseff was illegally and unjustly impeached for committing a budgetary infraction that was a non-impeachable offense called fiscal peddling, that was legalized immediately after she left office, that Bolsonaro did during his entire presidency. I mean, remember all these self-righteous journalists leading up to the impeachment talking, no, it really is important. It really was a big crime that she did. Fiscal peddling is a really big deal. They just remained silent the whole time Bolsonaro was doing it all the time. But then, okay, after she left office, they proved that she didn't even do it, right? So it was just a nonsensical, obvious excuse to hold this coup. Yeah, it was absolutely a coup. 3 days afterwards, Vice President Joe Biden, met with Michel Temer in Europe. They hugged, they laughed together, and Biden said, I'm giving you a message from the Obama administration that you have our full support. You have the full support of the US government, okay? You can look that up. I mean, during the days leading up to the coup, top officials from the opposition PSDB party, like Aloysio Nunes, Jose Serra, flew up to negotiate the privatization of Petrobras with John Kerry. Yeah, look, there it is. That's 3 days after the coup. So please, like, I mean, why not? It's almost like flat earthism to claim that Lula is like, the deer of the, of the Democratic Party. It's like flat earthism. I mean, obviously, he's got begrudging support of the Democratic Party right now. First of all, there's a core of around 30 congressmen and congresswomen who actually are connected to the labor movement and things like that, who actually showed support for Lula during his political imprisonment and things like that. So there's a tiny amount of Democrats that do, and it's not just progressive caucus members either. I mean, some of them most obvious people you would think would have been showing solidarity with Lula, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, haven't. Sometimes it's these Congress people are more surprising. You wouldn't imagine Hank Johnson, Susan Wild. There's a small core that, that seems to actually support Lula. But for the most part, it looks like the entire economic deep austerity policy that was implemented immediately after the coup, which put they passed a constitutional resolution to put spending caps on health and education spending before the pandemic, which ended up gutting, these institutions. They rose the retirement age. They transformed Brazil into a right-to-work nation. I mean, only a few of the worst states in the United States don't let unions organize the way that they've crippled the unions in Brazil. That was all. It looks like that whole policy called Bridge to the Future, it was drafted by the Democrats, by neoliberal Democrats. So, I mean, sure, but the party, what I was trying to say, like the party itself, the leadership, Biden and these people, they're begrudgingly supporting Lula right now only because of Bolsonaro's relationship with Steve Bannon and Trump. Because Bolsonaro didn't recognize the Biden victory. He was the last world leader to recognize Biden's electoral victory. So just out of an instinct for self-preservation and vindictiveness due to the relationship between Bolsonaro and Trump and Bannon and these people, they sent a congratulatory letter. They're supporting Lula's victory right now, and I imagine that they're going to immediately start trying to undermine his presidency after he takes office, because they don't want a Keynesian developmentalist doing things like what he said last night. He said Brazil shouldn't be a country that just exports commodities. It should be a country that exports knowledge. It should be a country that exports industrial products. We have to reindustrialize Brazil. That's not in the interest of the United States. The United States just sees Brazil as a source of cheap commodities.
Resource extraction, exactly. And that's the export-oriented model that you were talking about. I mean, in Latin America, there's a long history of something you're referring to, ISI, import substitution industrialization, this developmental model. It's not necessarily socialist, but it's a way of trying to develop these partially colonized economies, so they're not just resource colonies for the imperial core. So they don't just export raw materials and commodities to the U.S. and Europe. They actually want to develop their own industry, which of course can raise the living standards of their own workers. And that's something that Lula is deeply involved in, and he's part of. And let's not forget, when Lula was president in the first decade of the 2000s, the Brazilian economy grew at record rates, and I believe it tripled in size. And he wants to bring back some of those policies. This is actually a good segue, because I wanted to ask you about the mass privatizations we've seen under Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro himself, who he uses this discourse of nationalism, which is ridiculous, because he's actually one of the most anti-nationalist leaders Brazil has had in decades, in the sense that he sold off his country to foreign corporations, doing mass privatizations of state assets. You mentioned Petrobras, which was the largest, most important company in Brazil. And his economic minister, Paulo Guedes, is a Chicago boy who studied at the University of Chicago. And he went to Chile to teach economics under the fascist Pinochet dictatorship. So talk about what Bolsonaro's and Guedes' economic policies have done to Brazil.
Okay, it's worth noting, Guedes didn't just get his PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. He studied under Milton Friedman. He's one of the original Chicago boys, and he's widely considered to be the most mediocre of them, right? He couldn't even publish his dissertation in Brazil. So he's a mediocre Chicago boy, right? But I think it's important to point out here, just to bring the Democrats back into this, which is that there was total continuity on economic policy between the coup government of Michel Temer, which was installed by the Democrats, and the government of Bolsonaro, which was installed by the Republicans. There's this economic platform they created called Bridge to the Future. After Dilma was removed, Temer gave a speech in New York, and he said, I even believe it was at the headquarters of ASCOA. He said, Dilma was removed, because she didn't support Bridge to the Future. And Bridge to the Future, and I mean, the original document, Bridge, the plan for Bridge to the Future, it was written in such poor Portuguese that people speculated that it had been almost like Google translated from English. It wasn't written by a Brazilian person. And it's just a laundry list of Washington consensus style deep austerity cuts and privatizations. And so after Temer took office, changed the Constitution to butcher public health and spending, pushed labor laws back 80 years, back to the 1930s, and auctioned off a large portion of Brazil's offshore petroleum reserves that were owned by Petrobras at the time. Bolsonaro took office, and his economics minister, Paulo Guedes, gave total continuity. So if you looked at all of the recommendations in Bridge to the Future, it's like almost like a checklist. Okay, so Temer was unable to raise the retirement age. So the Bolsonaro administration managed to raise the retirement age. Temer was unable to start charging tuition for Brazil's free public university system, which was massively expanded during the Workers' Party years. Not just expanded, but they pushed through a social class-based affirmative action program, which only kids from families that made under like 1.5 times the minimum salary or 2 times the minimum salary who had studied only in public schools qualified for, with a small differential for Afro-Brazilians. So the percentage of university students in the system that are working class rose from like 2% to 52%. They structurally changed the university system. Bridge to the Future recommended starting to charge tuition in the public universities. And it was like, well, at first we'll charge tuition for middle class people who can afford it. Then the poor will be able to get grants based on the US system with Pell Grants. I mean, there was a time when a Pell Grant could pay your university tuition in the US, the public university. It can't anymore, right? But Temer wasn't able to do it. Bolsonaro tried to do it. 2 separate protests took place within a 2-week period, which brought more than 1 million people to the streets of hundreds of towns or cities in Brazil. And they successfully blocked Bolsonaro from doing this, but he tried. His government privatized Petrobras' entire gas station franchise, which was the largest gas station franchise in Brazil. It was taken over by BlackRock. Okay? They shut down oil refineries so that now, absurdly, an example of exactly what people like Raul Prebisch, Celso Furtado, and these economists from the 1950s, the exact example of the problem with the economy in Latin America. Now Brazil is exporting petroleum to the United States and buying 20% of its gasoline back from the United States because Bolsonaro shut down so many refineries. When he took office, Brazil was self-sufficient in gasoline. So these are just examples. I mean, also like just massively deregulating pesticide industry and gutting all of the environmental agencies and things like that. It's just like so much damage has been done to Brazil over the last 4 years, over the last 6 years. So it's going to take a while to get things back to where they even were, in the first place, before we can even start moving forwards.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Lula has a lot of obstacles facing him, and we'll talk about Congress as well in a second. Just undoing the damage done not only by Bolsonaro but by Temer. It's going to be a very difficult process, and of course, this is the result of 2 U.S.-backed coups, or a kind of ongoing process of coups. We talked about the judicial coup against Dilma Rousseff, the Workers' Party president, in 2016. But let's also talk about the politically motivated imprisonment of Lula in 2018, backed by the Trump administration, the U.S. Justice Department. This is what led Bolsonaro to being installed in power. He basically came to power through a U.S.-backed coup because Lula was leading in all of the polls in the 2018 presidential election, and he was imprisoned on false charges. The United Nations itself said this year, I mean, it came pretty late, but the UN Human Rights Committee finally ruled that Lula was arbitrarily detained. They said the investigation and prosecution of Lula da Silva violated his right to be tried by an impartial tribunal, his right to privacy, and his political rights. So that's as, this is from, again, the UN Human Rights Committee. That is as clear as it gets that this was a politically motivated coup. Talk about the 2018 coup against Lula backed by the US and how that was the only way that Bolsonaro even came to power in the first place.
Well, it's one of the reasons I'm so happy Lula won last night, because all of the media was getting, if Bolsonaro had won, they would have just pretended that this had never happened. And they would have said, oh, Bolsonaro wasn't elected in 2018 because Lula was imprisoned. He would have won anyway. Look, he just beat Lula, blah, blah, blah. Ignoring the fact that, Bolsonaro spent, according to Reuters, which is not, hardly a left-wing, Reuters did everything to help put Bolsonaro in power in the first place. But even Reuters said Bolsonaro has spent 173 billion reais of government funds. He channeled it into his campaign. Bolsonaro spent over 300 times more money on his campaign than Lula. In 2018, Bolsonaro did not have the machine of the state on his side to help him win an election. It is clear that
Brian,
it was money.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I just want you to repeat that. You said that Bolsonaro spent 300 times more money in his campaign than Lula. That's an incredible statistic.
Lula got about a little bit under the equivalent of like $2 million in campaign donations compared to 65 million in private donations for Bolsonaro. But Bolsonaro spent 173 billion of government funding on his campaign. The total amount spent on Lula campaign, including from the political party fund, was around $30 million. The total amount spent on the Bolsonaro campaign was around $54 billion. Okay, and how did he do it? Well, he took money away from cancer treatment and cancer research and routed it into financing a cut in the gasoline tax, during the lead up to the elections, because we were getting like record high gasoline prices. And so he used money that was supposed to be in the already like gutted public health system and he slashed money to the university system. He halted all payments to the federal public universities and routed it into these measures that would artificially lowered fuel prices, food prices, and things like that, and he raised welfare prices by 50% like 2 months before the election as well. So it's important to point out when you see these, Anglo pundits saying, "Oh, Lula just squeaked by." I mean, no. If you look at the money that was spent, it's a miracle that Lula managed to pull this off. Because money in a capitalist system, unfortunately, is one of the main, drivers of an election. I can't think of any election in the U.S. where such an underfunded candidate has managed to beat someone, with that much more money behind them. Maybe there is. I don't pay that much attention to U.S. politics, but so that's a big deal, and that's why in 2018 Lula would have just clobbered Bolsonaro, because Bolsonaro didn't have these resources. He didn't have much commercial airtime. Lula was leading Bolsonaro in the polls. Lula was leading the polls by more than double of the sum of all other candidates combined after he'd been imprisoned for 3 months and completely illegally and arbitrarily cut off, blocked from speaking to anyone in the press. Anyone in the press in Brazil can interview a mass murderer behind bars or rapist or anything. But this judge, Sergio Moro, who went on to be a cabinet minister in the Bolsonaro administration, a clear example of quid pro quo, blocked Lula. He issued an order just blocking. Lula can't speak to reporters. 3 months after he'd been barred from speaking to the press, he was still leading in the polls by that much of a margin. He would have won that election from behind bars without campaigning. And the first thing that Bolsonaro did after he took office was gave Sergio Moro the justice minister position and expanded the justice ministry into something called a super justice ministry, with more power. And then like a month later, they both visited CIA headquarters together. It's the first time a Brazilian president has ever visited CIA headquarters. And former governor of Paraná, Roberto Requião, said, he asked, like, did Sergio Moro's Wi-Fi automatically click on when he walked on his smartphone when he walked into CIA headquarters? But so this is all important because there's still people in the media trying to act like Lula was just let off. He was exonerated from these arbitrary corruption charges on a technicality, and it's a lie. He wasn't. What the Supreme Court did was they said, oh, he could be tried again, but you can't use any of the evidence that was presented against him in the Lava Jato, in the Operation Car Wash trials, which have all been totally reversed due to judicial bias, to criminal judicial bias. And so what the press isn't saying is that, well, immediately they said, look, it was all illegally forum shopped to a jurisdiction where didn't have any say, any control over, where none of the crimes were committed. If you want to try Lula again, you can open the case up, these cases up in Brasilia, but you can't use any of the evidence from Operation Car Wash. Well, there wasn't any evidence. Lula was jailed on one coerced plea bargain testimony from a corrupt business executive who was given millions of dollars in illicit asset retention and an 85% sentence reduction and transfer to house arrest in exchange for changing his story 3 times before they let him out of jail. That was the only evidence. There was no material evidence against Lula. So when a group of right-wing prosecutors tried to reopen these charges again in Brasilia, they were all immediately dismissed for not having any evidence. So that process is over. Like, he's been totally exonerated. It wasn't a technicality because the attempts to reopen the cases were all thrown out. There was never any evidence. It was just a joke. They spent years in the media pretending that Lula was this massive, he'd gotten all these millions of dollars in illicit funding and all of this crap. They used to talk about his yacht. Lula has a yacht. And the media was like, well, we need to take a picture of this yacht. And Sergio Moro, the judge, was like, no, we're not letting you access any of our evidence. Finally, some reporters found the yacht. It was an 11-foot aluminum fishing rowboat floating in a tilapia pond, and his friend's, modest, country house. That was the yacht, right? Then they tried to say that he had owned that country house, right? And that his friend was just a patsy who was letting them, put the property in his name. And they played it up like this huge plantation. It was just like a relatively nice, but not huge, not a mansion or anything, country house with this little tilapia pond next to it. The guy who they tried to portray as a patsy was the former Steelworkers Union from Campinas, which is the second biggest city in São Paulo state. And he'd been the mayor, for years of this city Campinas, which is like the 9th biggest city in Brazil. He obviously had enough money to buy that property. It just so happened because he was like Lula's Steelworkers Union buddy from the 1970s, and the two families vacation a lot together. They tried to play it up like this was this huge corruption scandal. That was the second scandal they tried to give him more years behind bars for after he'd already been imprisoned. It was also just completely thrown out. They could never find out. They could never prove. Basically, they said that Lula's wife had built a wine cellar in their mansion, in this mansion of this house, with illegal funding from a construction company. It was like a closet with 20 bottles of wine in it that she had stocked. As the former first lady of Brazil, she could afford it, right? The other thing is when they froze Lula's assets, Sergio Moro issued this order. We're freezing up to $15 million in Lula's assets. And so they froze his assets. You know how much money he had in his bank? I've told you this before. I never tire in repeating it. the money he had that they froze, it was less than half of what former US President Obama was charging for a single speaking engagement at that time. It was like $200,000. He had like a 1986 Ford pickup truck. That was one of his vehicles that they seized. And the guy's living, like, he's still living in the Gary, Indiana of Sao Paulo. I don't mean like it's not as destitute as Gary, but it's an industrial factory suburb of Sao Paulo. And he doesn't have a 25 million euro apartment in Paris like former Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso. He's a guy with modest tastes. I mean, even that so-called luxury triplex apartment on the beach in Sao Paulo that he never owned or set foot in, that they used as an excuse to jail him, it was kind of, even, you know, as Glenn Greenwald pointed out at the time, it was kind of like scummy and didn't look like something. It looked like below the standards of a former president of Brazil, you know. So it's funny because these are the people who get arrested for corruption. They don't ask why a former president has a 25 million euro apartment in Paris.
Or Bolsonaro himself. I mean, that guy, his family is very closely linked to organized crime and corruption. I mean, the irony is that the Workers' Party was accused of being corrupt, and yet Bolsonaro's party, which originally, I guess, was like the Social Liberal Party, and now it's just the Liberal Party.
It's a different party. He changed parties, but yeah,
infinitely more corrupt.
Well, so this was all about one apartment that it started when, like a typical person who grew up in poverty, Lula's wife, she decided to buy this like modest 2-bedroom apartment with her own money on installments over the course of like 10 years. And so it's a thing they do. I don't understand why anyone does it in Brazil, because there's always problems. But a construction company announces they're going to build a building, and so they sell apartments in the building before construction begins for a cheaper price so that they can finance the construction. So she'd been paying installments for like 8 years on this place. And it looks like the construction company thought, well, wow, if we have a former president moving here, it'll raise the value of the apartment. So let's see if we can offer her, a top apartment in the building at the same price. And she got nervous and refused, stopped paying the payments. That's all that was about, But yeah, it's just ridiculous because you compare that to the fact that it came out 2 months ago that the Bolsonaro family has purchased 51 properties, including luxury properties, in cash in the last 20 years, plus another 56 properties done, legally through banks and things like that. Like 51 properties in cash. That doesn't raise the level of scrutiny that these weasel, regime change stenographers in the Guardian, the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC and other places, the kind of moral self-righteousness the tisking they made about this one apartment in Guarujá, and they're just kind of silent about these 51 properties owned by the Bolsonaro family that were all paid for in cash. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, and in his victory speech, Lula said, "They buried me alive. I thought they destroyed my political career, but here I am." And that quote is so important and so powerful. They buried me alive. He was imprisoned for over a year. And by the way, when he was imprisoned, he was quite elderly. I mean, this guy, he's very powerful. Like, I don't have that much energy, and I'm like less than half his age. They imprisoned him, and he came back. He fought against these fake charges. I mean, he overcame so many incredible obstacles. It really is remarkable. And now I want to talk about a little bit more about Lava Jato. We mentioned that the fake charges against him were dropped, and eventually the Supreme Court in Brazil said that he was completely exonerated. You work with Brazil Wire. That's Brazil with an S. It's one of the best resources, an independent media outlet that reports in English on Brazil. And you and your colleagues published an article based on these leaked documents that came from the Lava Jato case that came from Lula's attorney's team. And it showed that one of the Lava Jato prosecutors referred to the imprisonment of Lula in 2018 as a gift from the CIA. And also, we know you mentioned that Bolsonaro, right after he entered office, and his super justice minister, Sergio Moro, who, of course, was clearly a U.S. asset backed by the U.S. in the fake anti-corruption operation that imprisoned Lula, they visited CIA headquarters, clearly to thank the CIA for helping carry out this coup. Talk a little bit more about these documents that were released in this case and the exoneration of Lula by Brazil's Supreme Court.
Okay, first of all, it's important to make a few points here because Greenwald goes around saying, I got Lula out of prison, right? I'm the one, I got him out of prison. Lula's release from prison and the Supreme Court ruling, was based on a motion filed by Lula's lawyers before these Vaza Jato leaks, these Telegram leaks came out, based on illegal collaboration with the U.S. government, because of a speech that Kenneth Blanco gave, Assistant Attorney General Kenneth Blanco gave at the Atlantic Council in 2017, in which he bragged about the constant informal communications between the Department of Justice and the Lava Jato Operation Car Wash prosecuting team. That's illegal in Brazil because he said it's so great to have these informal communications because it bypasses bureaucratic protocols which can slow down the circulation of information. Well, those protocols are in place to protect sovereignty, right? These are to protect the sovereignty of Brazil. You can't have low-level prosecutors being coached continually by the U.S. Department of Justice and FBI agents. All those communications have to go through the Justice Department in Brazil. Otherwise, it's almost like espionage or something. I mean, it's like it's a violation of sovereignty. So there were a lot of motions to dismiss and stuff before these leaks came, but these leaks were really important. The Intercept, through the brokerage of Glenn Greenwald, accepted about 3% of 6 terabytes of leaked Telegram conversations between the prosecutors. Some of them included Judge Sergio Moro. And then they started homeopathically releasing one article a week for over a year. I think it was 96 articles in all. And what it showed immediately was that there was constant illegal collusion between the judge and the prosecutors. A judge who's supposed to be impartial can't be coaching the prosecutors on how to leak information to the media, and giving them advice on what to say in court and things like that. That was going on the entire time. Then after over a year, a couple of other journalists in The Intercept finally released the article, the leaks that they had a hold of showing U.S. collaboration. This was after the Supreme Court had already seized all of the leaks and passed them on to Lula's defense team. This is a really important article. I think Andrew Fishman is one of the guys who was on it, and I can't remember the name of the Brazilian journalist off the top of my head. I could check later, but it's an article.
Oliveira, right?
Yeah, exactly. Sorry, that's an article that shows that for a period of several years, a group of 18 FBI agents, led by Leslie Bakshi's, was meeting with the Operation Car Wash prosecuting team every 2 weeks, instructing them how to prosecute Lula and the other people they were going after. And especially because the coerced plea bargain testimony was a new legal measure. It had only been legalized for use in Brazilian courts during the Dilma Rousseff administration at a request by Sergio Moro. She didn't know at the time. It was obviously a mistake on Dilma's part, but in her mind, she was like, oh yeah, I want to fight corruption. Is this something that's going to help us fight corruption? Sure, I'll sign this into law. And so this idea of using coerced plea bargain testimonies was recent. It was new, and it looks like that's what the FBI was giving him advice on like go after his family, have a raid on the house of his children. They seized his grandson's iPad, his 7-year-old grandson's iPad, and never give it back. And invite the media all the time. Invite the media to all these events. Make it look like they're guilty of something. This is the kind of coaching that was going on the whole time, which is why it's and at the same time, a group of around 20 U.S. congressmen and women were trying to get more and more information about what was the U.S. role in this all. And they launched an inquiry in Congress to the Department of Justice, demanding answers on, among other things, what was their role in Lula's arrest. And it took a long time. They stalled to answer. But when they finally answered, it's like, look, we've been talking about our partnership with Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash, on our own website since 2016. Here's some links to some of our articles about it. This is why it's so ridiculous that people used to and still treat Brazil Wire, myself, and as conspiracy theorists for publishing articles. I've written over 40 articles about U.S. involvement in Lava Jato. Like, calling me a conspiracy theorist because I wrote an article about the DOJ's involvement in Lava Jato with links to articles on the DOJ's own website. But I'm a conspiracy theorist because I'm saying the DOJ is involved. I mean, it was all over the media, New York Times, everywhere in 2016, when a U.S. court levied the largest fine in the history of the United States on a foreign company, $3.5 billion fine on Petrobras, Brazil's state petroleum company, as part of Operation Car Wash. That was in the media. And then at that point, all of a sudden it all just disappeared. Like, from that point forwards, no mention of this partnership was made in U.S. media again until this Intercept article that came out.
Yeah, I mean, that episode is so misunderstood and so distorted by the media, including, some independent media outlets have done a very bad job in reporting on that. So I really, which again, want to recommend to everyone listening, you should check out Brazil Wire, one of the best resources. I would say, in terms of English language coverage, the best resource to understand politics in Brazil. You all have really helped inform my view of Brazil over the past several years. I want to talk a little bit more about BRICS. We were discussing earlier about how Lula was one of the co-founders of BRICS. It was partially his idea. I mean, he was so integral in the development of BRICS. We've already seen the response of China's President Xi Jinping. Reuters just published this newswire based on comments that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, said about Lula's victory. Xi said, "I attach great importance to the development of China-Brazil relations." He said that he's going to work with President-elect Lula from a strategic and long-term perspective to jointly plan and promote to a new level the comprehensive strategic partnership between China and Brazil for the benefit of the two countries and its peoples. That's an important line there. Of course, if people know how diplomatic ease works, if you know how diplomats speak, they often speak in a very cautious way. But referring to their alliance as a comprehensive strategic partnership is very important, because that's the same language that China uses to refer to its alliance with Russia, a comprehensive strategic partnership. And the article notes that relations between China and Brazil worsened under Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro himself campaigned demonizing China and the Chinese communists. He blamed China. Well, one second. He blamed China for COVID. I want to talk about that in a second. And then this article also points out that Lula praised China and its response to COVID. And he also praised the Communist Party of China and contrasted it to the weakening of the state in Latin America and developing countries. So those are clear signs that Lula wants to strengthen his alliance with China. He already condemned the U.S. Cold War against China, and he praised specifically China in response to its COVID policies, which saved millions of lives. Whereas Bolsonaro, not only did he blame China for COVID, he was a straight up COVID denier, an anti-vaxxer, and And after the US, Brazil had probably the worst response to COVID in the entire world. Over 1 million people died in the US and hundreds of thousands of people died in Brazil. So maybe you can talk about Brazil-China relations and also COVID.
Yeah, well, Brazil-China relations. I just wanted to point out that, Tucker Carlson, Glenn Greenwald's buddy, did that whole stupid documentary trying to make it look like Jair Bolsonaro was the last Latin American leader who, was opposed to China, and how he was such an important ally in the new Cold War against China, and it doesn't hold up. There was some anti-Chinese rhetoric during the first year of Bolsonaro's regime. The most racist he had ministers like making fun of the way Chinese people talk on tweets and things like that. I mean, it's just like total anti-China stuff. Those ministers were all forced out of office, and actually the biggest beneficiary of privatizations during the Bolsonaro's government was China in terms of petroleum. They were the only people who bought Petrobras offshore oil reserves during the first two auctions of the Bolsonaro administration. And trade continued to increase. So that 2009 was the first year that trade with China eclipsed trade with the United States and Brazil. Last year, China engaged in 4 times more trade with Brazil. Brazil engaged in 4 times more trade with China than it did with the United States. So regardless of the rhetoric, the Bolsonaro administration was unable to break any ties with China. China is way too important for Brazil. And that's why it should be treated strategically, which is what is going to happen now with Lula. It's good for Brazil that someone who has some kind of vision of planning and not just like do everything in a laissez-faire manner based on short-term profits. It's going to be good for both countries, I think.
Yeah, it's incredible. Bolsonaro campaign demonizing China, his largest trading partner. It shows that this political rhetoric is one thing, but there's also economic reality. China has the world's largest economy, according to purchasing power parity measurement. And the reality is that Bolsonaro did all of these things to try to attack China, blaming it for COVID. And yet the reality is because the Brazilian economy, and also ironically, because many of the same Brazilian capitalists who supported Bolsonaro, it was in their economic interest to continue doing trade with China. I read that allegedly it was actually many of Bolsonaro's corporate sponsors, his funders, the capitalists in Brazil, they were the ones telling him to stop antagonizing China so much because it's the biggest market for our products and we need to do trade with them. And then you talk about COVID. Bolsonaro, he blamed China for COVID. In the US, Trump blamed China for COVID. They called it the China virus or whatever, which is absurd. We now see Senate Republicans are once again trying to bring back this conspiracy, blaming China and saying it's like a Chinese bioweapon or whatever. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Brazilians died because Bolsonaro basically, ironically, he claimed that it was like a China virus that was attacking us, but at the same time, he also claimed that it wasn't a big deal. It's this funny right-wing contradiction where they say simultaneously that COVID is an advanced Chinese bioweapon from the Chinese communists to destroy Western civilization, but simultaneously it's also blue, and it's not bad. It doesn't
hurt anybody though, so it's like a weak international bioweapon.
Yeah, so talk about Brazil's response or lack thereof and how COVID was dealt with.
There's a whole long congressional investigation that proved a lot of, from embezzling in vaccine procurement to stalling for months before the vaccines first arrived, and then telling his especially evangelical followers that if they took the vaccine, they were going to get sick. It could make women grow beards. If women take the vaccine, they'll grow beards. Don't use masks. All of this stuff. My wife lost 12 family members, to COVID because they live in a city that had a Bolsonarista mayor who didn't do any lockdowns or anything like that. And it's just like now, okay, Brazil historically has had one of the world's best vaccine programs in its public health system. One of the best. And one of the best public health systems for a lot of things, for HIV as well. Antiretroviral drugs are free in Brazil, even though Bolsonaro just butchered that program to help fund his re-election campaign as well. Hopefully that's going to be immediately reinstalled. But now, even though he was unable to prevent the vast majority of the Brazilian population from getting vaccinated for COVID, it's having like a lag time effect where they just announced that like right now, less than 60% of Brazilian children at this age for this vaccination have not gotten vaccinated. Less than 60% have gotten vaccinated for polio. And you need like 90% to prevent a new polio outbreak. So the World Health Organization is worried that there's going to be a polio outbreak here because of Bolsonaro. He's also like not sending the vaccine to clinics in a lot of places because it's another example of cuts he's made in health spending to help his re-election campaign that failed.
Yeah, and I have to say that across Latin America, Brazil is often seen as a model in terms of its health system. And this goes back even decades, even to be fair, before Lula. I mean, Lula did expand healthcare and spend more money. But across Latin America, I've heard many people in multiple countries say that they see Brazil's health system as a model. Maybe you can talk a bit more about the communal health system.
Well, there's a lot of variation state by state, but both my kids were born in public hospitals, and there's some public maternity hospitals that are better than anything I've seen in the United States. To be frank, public. I mean, I like living in a country where I know that if I get sick, I'm not going to go bankrupt. It has its problems. These problems have been exacerbated deeply since the 2016 coup. But in general, there are all kinds of things that you can get for free in Brazil, including hundreds of medications, that are free, including antiretrovirals. I don't know what, insulin. Insulin is free in Brazil. Things that people in the US pay $1,000 a month for. And so, I mean, I just think in general, having lived in, like 28 years in the US and 27 years in Brazil, knowing how both systems work, I think treatment is just better when it's public because they don't give you, they don't recommend unnecessary treatments just to make more money off of you. And they don't, recommend unnecessary medications, just to like get commissions from or something. So like, if you're hurt, they try and figure it out in an efficient way. Whereas in the US, I've had private health insurance here in Brazil at different periods, depending on my jobs. I remember once I had a good private insurance plan. I went into the hospital with a case of gout and said, "Oh, well, do you have any other symptoms?" "Well, my stomach's upset." "Let's do a tomography." "Oh, we're worried, we're worried now that your spleen looks a little bit large. I think we've got to hold you here for a few days to see if you have leukemia or not." And so I spent like 4 days missing work in this hospital, freaking out, and then the person came and said, "Oh, well, we didn't know how big your spleen was beforehand, so we can't really say. You don't have leukemia from your blood test, so you can go now." That's what they do when you have health insurance. When it's public, they would have never done that to me in a public system. At the most, they would have said, "Oh, we're worried you might have some kind of disease. Come back in 2 days and take a blood test," whatever. They wouldn't have held me in a private hospital room for that. So I just think, in general, public health is always better than the U.S. private system. And the Brazilian system does have its problems. There are situations where it takes a long time to get surgery. In some states, it takes a really long time, but it's free, right? So that's the good thing about it. And it's going to improve again now with, Lula's going to lift the constitutional spending caps. I'm sure of it. It'll improve.
Yeah, and so I want to talk now a little bit about Bolsonaro's response to to Lula's electoral victory, or the lack of response. Thus far, he has refused to acknowledge that he lost, and we're seeing signs that he's going to try to pull a Trump and refuse to acknowledge that Lula won. We've also seen comments from Steve Bannon, this far-right fascistic operative. Steve Bannon, of course, was the chief strategist for Trump's campaign, but less known is that Steve Bannon is active around the world. He funds far-right groups with the support of billionaires. I mean, it's so funny because Steve Bannon calls himself like a populist or whatever, but actually he's funded by a bunch of billionaire capitalist oligarchs. Like there's nothing populist about him. He's entirely backed by a certain faction of the capitalist class, which is the fascistic far-right faction. And Steve Bannon was very involved in Brazil. Steve Bannon's networks were very involved with Bolsonaro and his family, especially his son, Eduardo Bolsonaro. And now we see that Steve Bannon is helping to take the lead in claiming, without a single shred of evidence, that Lula stole the election, which is, of course, ironic because you can talk about the massive voter suppression where Bolsonaro's loyalists in the highway police and the military were trying to prevent people in areas where Lula is popular from voting on election day. But anyway, the point is that Steve Bannon is taking the lead in claiming without a scintilla of evidence that Lula stole the election. And we see that Bolsonaro has refused to acknowledge the victory. So what do you think the Bolsonaristas are doing here? And of course, I don't think they're going to be successful, but do you think they'll pull a Trump and just refuse to admit that they lost?
Yeah, I think that's already happening. I mean, he spent a year and a half preparing people for this, that the election was going to be stolen. Ironically, as you said, they tried to keep people in the regions that had the most support for Lula from voting. But there was a tactic that doesn't work in Brazil where, turnout's a lot higher. We don't have an electoral college system. It looks like Bolsonaro got kind of bad advice with this idea of having his highway police stop buses of taking people to election centers. And in any event, the election court put a stop to it 2 hours before the end of voting. They're going to try, right now we have some groups of so-called truckers, right? I mean, you and I wrote an article about these trucker strikes that are really orchestrated by, the people who treat them like trucker strikes ignore that there's a class system within the community of truckers. They're the owners of the big companies that hire truckers. They're the owner-operators who are petit bourgeois, and they're the hired truckers. But groups, trucking companies are blocking off major highways right now. I have a friend who's stuck trying to get back to Rio de Janeiro, right? Yeah, there's thing about the trucker protests. But
I'm sorry to cut you off, but we should just point out that this is a tactic that Bolsonaro has used multiple times, going back several years, where the owners of these trucking companies, who are millionaires, who fund Bolsonaro, they pay all of these truckers to go out on the streets to paralyze the country. This was also something that happened in Brazil's version of January 6th. Maybe briefly you can talk about that and how they're bringing those tactics back right now.
Yeah, well, there was supposed to be this kind of January 6th style shutdown of the Supreme Court on September 7th, 2021 in Brazil, and I was there. And basically they pretended that the truckers had stormed the National Mall called the Esplanada in Brasilia, when actually they had a permit. And they arrived half an hour early, half an hour before midnight, and the police on the scene said, "Oh, you can come in early." And then they treated a media event as if they were storming the mall. And then they parked as close as they could get to the barricade, that was 100 yards in front of the Supreme Court. And they were all parked there honking Brazilian flags on the trucks and stuff. I walked by filming discreetly with my smartphone and discovered that they were all from the same company. This company called Pro Torque. The owner, Marlon Baunilla, is a massive supporter of the Bolsonaro campaign. One of these elite comprador types. And then there were these, viralizing YouTube videos from this one trucker who call themselves Zetrovão, and I'm coming with helicopters, I'm storming, I've got hundreds of truckers with me. They found out after the event that he didn't even have a trucker's license. He wasn't a trucker at all. He had to flee the country. He was arrested in Mexico later, for trying to start an armed insurrection against the Supreme Court. It's not this guy. Yeah, it's not a freedom of speech issue. When you're like, when you're saying we have weapons and we're going to attack a branch of government, it's not.
Well, it was also reported that Eduardo Bolsonaro gave him thousands of dollars to help organize.
He grifted Eduardo Bolsonaro. Yeah, like he said he was coming with helicopters and hundreds of trucks, and Eduardo Bolsonaro sent him, $10,000 or something, which he used to flee the country. So we have something similar going on. There are these videos circulating on WhatsApp and Telegram saying like, we've closed down hundreds of roads across the country. We're going to wait 72 hours for military intervention. Blah, blah, the military's coming, blah, blah, blah. And then in reality, it's like 10 highways. It's still a lot. But I think for now, I'm not a psychic, but I think the end game here is not to have a coup. It's to create enough doubt that they can leave the Lula administration continually destabilized, with a large percentage of the population not recognizing its legitimacy, like you have in the United States with Biden victory, So I think there's some other purpose. Basically, when you've got China, India, Russia, the United States, NATO through Zelensky, whatever, everyone immediately recognizing the fairness of the election and recognizing Lula's victory, I don't think the Brazilian military are going to get on board with like a 1960s style, imposition of a military junta. I just don't think that's going to happen. As Camila Escalante, who's done incredible, I think, reporting on these elections. She's the only foreign journalist I know who came down for the entire process. She was down here for the entire 6-week electoral campaign season. She says these kinds of coups don't happen when everyone in the world's watching. Normally they happen in the shadows. So I think the end game here is just destabilization, trying to weaken his mandate, which the crowds that poured onto the streets of Avenida Paulista last night showed. He does have a massive amount of support. But they're going to try and weaken his mandate so that he's blackmailed into maintaining as much of this bridge to the future economic program as possible.
Yeah, and I do want to talk about Congress and the obstacles he'll face there. But before that, I want to talk about Venezuela, because this is not a minor issue. Bolsonaro was a key figure in the U.S.-led coup attempt against Venezuela's Bolivarian government. Bolsonaro himself was deeply involved in the coup attempt. In fact, we know because of reporting from mainstream Brazilian media outlets like O Globo that Bolsonaro's regime backed violent terrorist attacks, cross-border attacks in Venezuela. Of course, Brazil and Venezuela share a border. So Bolsonaro himself literally supported terrorism, terror attacks on Venezuela. And of course, he supported, at least originally, the U.S. puppet Juan Guaido, and refused to recognize Nicolás Maduro as the real elected president of Venezuela. Meanwhile, Lula da Silva, during the coup attempt, at the peak of the coup attempt in early 2020, Lula reaffirmed, he said that Nicolás Maduro is the elected president of Venezuela. And Lula referred to Guaido as a fraud and a criminal who should be in prison. And in response to his victory on the night of October 30th, Lula retweeted, he did this for many leaders of the world, right? Like Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Antonio Costa of Portugal. So it wasn't just Maduro, but the fact that Lula retweeted the congratulations from Nicolás Maduro shows that Lula is going to restore diplomatic relations with Venezuela, which Brazil has not had for years now. And it shows that, although, again, Lula is not a revolutionary, he's not Hugo Chavez, but he is going to be a friend of Venezuela, and he's going to help be part of this process of ending the never-ending U.S. coup attempt against Venezuela. Talk about Brazil Venezuela relations and what Lula could potentially do.
Okay, but first I'm just laughing at who Twitter is suggesting that you friend based on that post. But
I don't know.
I
only know who,
you'd love that guy. You would love.
I only know who Simon Tevez is, but I don't know who Fernando Enrique
Cardoso.
Okay.
Bill Clinton's favorite president of all times, and Anita, the pop singer. So there you go.
Well, apparently Twitter associates them with Lula's account.
Yeah. Well, they all supported Lula, so there you go.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. But look, Brazil is a big country with a big conservative population. The PT, the Workers' Party supporters represent, it's the most popular political party in Brazil by far. You know, around 25% of Brazilians who are affiliated with any political party are members of PT. The next most popular party is like 2%, has 2% of Brazilian population. That's because there's a core base of labor union and social movement people who are faithful allies to the PT, who realize that in a capitalist society, you know, it's not going to be as far left as they would wish it could be. Their government, they always consider the governments to be more conservative than the party itself, you know? And the strategy of PT since its inception has been based on the failure of armed revolutionary groups like the ones that Dilma Rousseff and Workers' Party original founders like José Genuíno were involved in. Due to the failure of armed revolution, they've always considered themselves to be a radical reform party based on the tenets of Antonio Gramsci, of entering existing power structures and working to create spaces of counter-hegemony, democracy deepening. That's why instead of just defaulting on debt to the IMF, Lula paid it back early together with Nestor Kirchner. The next day, the IMF laid off 2,000 workers. They weren't expecting it. They lost a lot of money because of this. And then why he lent money to the IMF so that Brazil could have votes within the structure of the IMF. It also explains why he made, you know, the move which he's highly criticized over of joining, heeding Kofi Annan's request to join the UN multilateral MINUSTAH mission. It was because in his mind, it was a way of Brazil entering a space of power and expanding counter-hegemony in Haiti, you know, which was, I think, in hindsight, a mistake, but it explains the logic behind it, right? So they're not a radical left party. They're not a radical revolutionary party. They're a reform party.
Brian,
yeah.
But another goal, and again, this is widely recognized today to have been a very bad mistake, and the UN occupation was involved in horrible crimes in Haiti. Although blaming Brazil and which was a minor character, and ignoring the role of the US and Canada and France, which were the main members of the core group, is kind of strange. There's so much anger about Brazil and Lula, but there's less discussion of the role of the US, Canada, and France. But anyway, the point is that...
And it's from people who live in the US and pay taxes to the US war machine. The people who
exactly.
Most of the people who attack Lula for Haiti pay taxes to the US war machine. Half of their income tax goes to the US. They're part of the US. So it makes me wonder what the deal is, because I have lots of friends in Haiti who are not that like radically opposed. I got one of the first WhatsApp messages I got last night was from a friend from a long-standing left-wing political family in Haiti who would always ask me not to mention his name because he doesn't want to get tied up in these kind of arguments. But, you know, he congratulated me on Lula's win. You know, and he's someone who refuses to flee Haiti because there's a portion of the Haitian left, going back to the spiralist movement, which thinks it's cowardly to go into exile. You know, they would rather make the compromises they need to stay alive and stay in their home country than flee it, no matter how bad it gets. And my buddy down there is lying on the ground of his house every day now for several hours with machine gun bullets flying around, and he refuses to go into exile. Right. So anyway, that's a separate tangent.
Yeah. Well,
but what I'm saying, getting back to
one quick point,
the relationship with Venezuela. Yeah.
No, but the other point is that although again, this is something that that I think many people in Brazil recognize to have been a very bad error, and they've apologized for. But that said, the thing about Brazil also is that it thought that it could try to reform the Security Council specifically, because Brazil is the 7th most populous country on earth, 215 million people. And it's insane that we have this colonial system where the 5 permanent members of the Security Council are the winners of World War II. And yes, it makes sense for China, the largest country with 1.4 billion people. It makes sense for the US and Russia, which are very big countries. But it's crazy that Britain and France, which comparatively speaking are rather small countries, have permanent seats in the Security Council, but not Brazil or India or Pakistan or Indonesia or Nigeria or Kenya. So Lula thought that he could help to democratize the UN Security Council by having more global South representation. But of course, we saw that unfortunately that didn't actually happen.
Yeah, and I was there, like I've been to Haiti 3 times. I was there working after, I got there 3 days after the earthquake, and then I returned that year during the cholera epidemic, which was caused by Traval's wife's sewage disposal company throwing the Nepalese, soldiers' sewage into a river where women did laundry. And I saw that disaster, which you have to, blame the UN for, because they were there. They spread the cholera. I was there when that happened. So I don't dismiss or write off Haiti. I love Haiti. That's why it just, I get really stressed out sometimes when, I think that most people in Brazil are really, embarrassed. The idea wasn't definitely to spend 10 years there. I think it was an error, but you have to understand the logic behind it, which was, as you say, to try and open space for third world countries within the UN Security Council and, open space of counter hegemony. But anyway, that's a different subject. With Venezuela, getting back to Venezuela, it's ironic. You have these small left-wing parties in Brazil that consider themselves harder left or more left than the PT, like the PSOL, which has some good politicians in it. But the PT is consistently better on these kinds of issues of South-South solidarity. So like when Lula was in jail, Gleisi Hoffmann, the president of the PT party, went to Nicolas Maduro's inauguration, and their 2014 presidential candidate, Luciana Genro, publicly criticized the Workers' Party for going to the inauguration of a dictator, one of the most important people within the PSOL party. The PSOL party also praised the Hong Kong protests. They invited, protesters from Hong Kong to give a speech in Sao Paulo initially, So you see some instances of people acting like they're hard left, they're farther left than the PT, but on international issues, the Workers' Party is much more a friend of other international left and part of the international left than some of these other smaller political parties. You can criticize the Workers' Party and the Lula presidency on a bunch of things, economically, not rupturing with capitalism or whatever, not transforming Brazil into a socialist society and things like that. But on international issues, you'll see that we didn't go into the war in Iraq. Lula said to Bush, my war is with hunger, solidarity, all good relations with China, refusing to put sanctions on Iran, visiting Iran several times, trying to negotiate an end to the nuclear crisis in Iran. And you'll see that sometimes Lula will say things about Ortega or Maduro or something like that. His one criticism he makes all the time is based on his pet peeve, which is that he thinks that there should be an alternance of power. He wishes that Ortega could find a successor and not concentrate all of the power in the hands of a single leader person. So that there could be successive left-wing governments in Nicaragua. And he says the same about Venezuela. But you see what the result of that was in Brazil. It didn't really work out very well. Because there was a lot of pressure for him to run for office for a third time. And he was like, no, I believe in alternance of power. I'm definitely not going to change the law to allow myself to run for a third time. And then what happened? he helped get Dilma Rousseff elected, and they couped her because she didn't have the political, savvy that he had. Really, she was a brilliant.
We saw what happened in Bolivia when Evo Morales was criticized for trying to go back for a fourth term, and there was a coup.
Yeah, it's just like, I mean, that's the one thing. Like sometimes people on the left in other countries in Latin America, why did Lula say this? Why did he do this? First of all, you have to understand, during the election season, Bolsonaro was spending, millions and millions of dollars accusing Lula of being a collaborator with communist dictatorships. And also of being a baby killer. Basically, Lula's a communist baby killer who hobnobs with horrible dictators like Daniel Ortega. And so whenever the mainstream media asked him about this stuff, baby killer being because he's historically supported the right to abortion as recently as like 6 months ago. So whenever they asked him about this, he said, oh, no, I don't personally support abortion. And like he would say about Nicaragua and Venezuela, any problem with those countries has to be solved by the citizens of that country. It's not our job as Brazilians to intervene in any other foreign nation. We have to respect their sovereignty. Personally, I believe that, Daniel Ortega should have stepped down after 3 mandates and let someone else run, because I believe in alternates of power. And then I saw a lot of criticism like on Twitter and stuff when he said this stuff, but you have to put it into the context of, endless accusations that he was friends with dictators, which I get accused of myself because I work for Telesur. That moron, well, I won't even go into it. A moron, I won't say his name, who works for one of the biggest newspapers in the world, accused me of getting my paychecks signed by a dictator. Nicolas Maduro signs my paychecks, so my journalism's invalid, and it's just like, it's factually incorrect. I don't get my paycheck signed by Nicolas Maduro. And also Telesur, I'm proud that Telesur is associated with the Venezuelan government, but Telesur is multilateral. It's several governments in Latin America. That's why when you go look at Telesur's Twitter page, it doesn't say this, this company, this media is associated with the government of Venezuela. It says this media is associated with several Latin American governments, without naming names.
Absolutely.
That was a bit of a tangent. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, this is important context. And I will say just a very brief anecdote. I was in Caracas, Venezuela in 2019 for the Foro de Sao Paulo, which of course is named the Foro de Sao Paulo because it was originally formed in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And Lula was a big part of that. But anyway, the point is that I was at the 2019 summit of the Foro de Sao Paulo in Caracas. And on July 28th, there was a celebration of Hugo Chavez's birthday. Of course, he passed away, but celebrating what would have been his birthday. And at that ceremony, there were all the representatives from different parties, from left-wing parties across Latin America and the Caribbean. And Nicolas Maduro gave a speech at the end of the ceremony, and he led a chant of Lula libre, Lula libre. So, I mean, Venezuela, all the other major left-wing parties across Latin America and the Caribbean support Lula. They support the Workers' Party in Brazil. And especially when he was imprisoned, they were campaigning for him to be freed because they understand that, again, Lula is not Fidel Castro. He's not a revolutionary, but in the context of Brazilian politics, he is by far the most important left-wing political leader, and is not only in terms of his social policies of fighting poverty and hunger and fighting climate change, which is a topic I want to ask about in a second, but also in terms of his commitment to regional integration. Lula has always been committed to fighting against imperialism and hegemony, and also fighting to strengthen Latin America's voice on the international stage. And we talk about a multipolar world. He understands that a multipolar world is not only condemning and opposing European and US imperialism, but also turning Latin America and the Caribbean into one of those poles, into having its own international influence and fighting to create a new kind of international system. And, there's so many things we could say about that, but another topic that is extremely important here that we haven't gone into is climate change. And Brazil, of course, has been referred to as the lungs of the planet Earth because of the Amazon rainforest. Bolsonaro himself, he proudly said that he's Captain Chainsaw, and he gave Brazilian big agriculture corporations free rein to just destroy the Amazon and deforest illegally, and also basically commit genocide and ethnic cleansing against indigenous nations in Brazil. So let's talk about climate change and the Amazon rainforest and how Lula can do a complete 180 compared to Bolsonaro.
Okay, but first I have to let you know, I started talking about Telesur, and I just opened my phone, and I forgot I've got to work. I still got to do some work for Telesur today. So
we'll wrap up soon.
I can talk a little bit longer, but I can't stay on as long as I wish I could, because I think this is I always really enjoy talking to you.
Yeah, same here.
Well, you know as well as I do, Ben, that there's a cadre of international Trotskyist, academic, some of them associated with NED, who always try to attack the Latin American left for being anti-environment, right? Like, oh my God, Evo Morales' government was a failure because he failed to, wean the nation off of petroleum, as if it's the job of the periphery nations in the international capitalist system to lead that fight, right? So there, I've had to argue with a bunch of people over the years about, attacking the Workers' Party for its environmental record. First of all, the Lula government was, and I've seen, journalists say this, there's no real significant difference between Lula's record on the Amazon and Bolsonaro's and things like that. It's just ludicrous, right? The Amazon is a huge area, very lawless in many places, because the kinds of people who get involved in illegal logging are armed criminal gangs, right? With good weapons and things like that. So if you look at the most violent areas in Brazil, they're always in the areas where they're cutting down the forest. So it's a huge expansion of territory. It's larger. The Amazon is larger than the United States, the continental United States. And so there's always been a problem of enforcement, which is getting better and better with, was getting better and better with satellite technology until Bolsonaro fired all the leaders of the satellite monitoring department, all resigned after he butchered their funding. But it's important to remember that the Lula administration won an award in the UN for being the world leader in greenhouse gas emission reduction during his presidency. And this was done mainly by 80% reduction in deforestation, right? There's other things have to be done. I mean, they have to replant as well. What they're doing now, unfortunately, because this ridiculous neoliberal green capitalism carbon credit system, is that people are getting carbon credit for planting eucalyptus forests in former Amazon. And eucalyptus just devastates the environment, right? The MST calls it the green desert. But not only did they make massive reductions in deforestation, they spend a lot of money on wind and solar, and alternative fuel research and things like that. And so the first thing that has to happen when Lula takes office is he has to reestablish funding for all of the governmental regulatory agencies and the Indigenous Affairs Bureau that have been completely gutted by Bolsonaro. All the enforcement agencies, that had their guns taken away from them by Bolsonaro. And look what happened. Bruna Pereira, who was murdered alongside Guardian journalist Dom Phillips, he was the leader of one of these local agencies in the Amazon, and he went on leave because they weren't letting him do his job anymore. So he was working with another indigenous group on leave from the regulatory agency because Bolsonaro just paralyzed all of the agencies. So that's the first thing that has to be done. I would like to see them replanting a lot of these areas that have been deforested, but Lula has said repeatedly, and I've seen him in like 4 campaign events or 5, I've seen him like 6 campaign events, but 4 where he gave speeches and stuff covering it for Telesur. He said that Brazil can increase its agricultural production without cutting down 1 tree. You know, he said last night, a clean river in his acceptance speech, 1 clean river is worth more than all of the gold they could pull out of the Amazon, because the illegal gold mining, you know, poisons all the rivers with mercury, right? So what we can expect from him is immediately reinstating the proper budget, you know, increased budget for all of these agencies, and more investment in wind and solar. You know, he's also been, you know, he also, during his presidency, they developed really good programs on climate change adaptation. One of them was installing nearly 2 million family rainwater capture systems. They're called cisterns. They're like these huge tanks in the semi-arid regions of the Northeast, which is, you know, a huge region, 50 million people. It suffers from massive droughts. Those droughts are one of the reasons the populations of Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro are so big. Their populations quintupled in a 40-year space of time because of massive droughts in the Northeast that drove so many poor people to migrate down to them, including Lula himself. You know, his family was starving to death, so they had to travel in 1954 on a 14-day journey down to Sao Paulo. So the installation of these rainwater capture systems has greatly diminished migration from the rural Northeast to the big cities, because people, if they have enough water to plant their crops, then they don't want to leave up there, really, you know?
Yeah, I mean, that itself is a huge topic we could spend a lot of time discussing, but I know I want to be respectful of your time. You have to go do more reporting. It's a very busy day for you. So we can start wrapping up here. I have one very important question before we wrap up, and that is the question of the Congress. I've mentioned this a few times. I didn't talk about it earlier because it's easy to get stuck in the weeds and it's kind of boring to people. But just so people who are still listening, if they want to understand the difficulties that Lula could have governing, let's play a little inside baseball for a second and just talk about the 2 chambers of the Congress. We know that the Workers' Party formed an electoral alliance with the Communist Party and also with the Green Party. And they're one of the larger coalitions in the Congress, but they don't have a majority in either chamber, which means that Lula is going to have to make political alliances with many kind of centrist parties, even, you know, neoliberal parties, in order to try to get legislation passed. Although he still has the possibility of, you know, executive actions, and Lula has a history of governing with a divided Congress like this. So can you explain what the Congress looks like right now and what the possibility would be for a Bolsonarista right-wing opposition within the Congress?
Okay, well, I wrote about this in an article I published in Brazil Wire that got rerun in FAIR, which is last month. It's like media spins Lula victory as defeat. I see a lot of people saying like, oh my God, he didn't get a majority in Congress. Bolsonaro didn't get a majority in Congress either. Last night, 6 of Bolsonaro's 8 gubernatorial candidates lost as well. The PT increased its number of members of Congress to the same level it was during the Dilma Rousseff administration. After 6 years of having its name, the party name, dragged through the mud, erroneously associated with corruption, they've restored themselves to the same level they were in Congress during the Dilma Rousseff administration. 68 members of the 514 strong Congress. There's 23 political parties represented in Congress. It's the second biggest party in Congress after Bolsonaro's, you know, party, which the name of which gives such a headache to Tucker Carlson and probably Greenwald too, that you never see them mentioning the name of his party. The
Liberal Party.
The Liberal Party. The liberals associated, the liberal elites, you know, associated with Bolsonaro, they have 90 seats, okay? But you take this 68, the other direct coalition members, Communist Party, PV, they have 12. That raises up to 80. And then there's the PSOL, you know, which I like to make fun of them sometimes just to annoy American, like Brooklyn hipster leftists who've been treating PSOL as the future of the Brazilian left for the last 8 years. telling everyone we should forget about Lula and the PT because the PSOL was the future. That's my beef with people in the U.S. The PSOL itself, in Congress, is a faithful ally to the Workers' Party. So much so that Guilherme Boulos decided not to run for president this year because he didn't want to be manipulated like Ciro Gomes was into being this kind of like third path alternative to weaken Lula's candidacy. They have 12. They got another 2 members. So you have to include them with this 80. And you can say this core bloc that's going to vote together on everything is 92. So it's a little bit stronger than Bolsonaro's party, although they have their alliances as well. Neither of these core groups have a majority. The majority are these historic center-right parties, ranging to far-right and center-right, but they're connected to the 300 families, descendants of the former plantation owners that have been running this, that were running the country for 500 years before Lula made history and took office in 2000 as the first poor, person to ever get into the presidency. So these parties have a tradition of just sticking to whoever's in power, right? So, what it means is that in order to govern, the PT's not going to be able to be as far left as they want to be because they're going to need to make concessions to parties like the MDB, Democratas, and other big parties that have more, lots of representatives there. That's exactly what the PT did the first 13 years they were in office. The PT never had more than 25% of Congress, okay? Bolsonaro's group looks like a big block of, ideologically aligned supporters. Most of the ideologues, a lot of the ideologues in the Bolsonaro group lost re-election. His group of far-right evangelicals that spanned several different right-wing parties, they lost 31 seats. They lost 31 seats in Congress. A lot of the most prominent Bolsonaro supporters from 2018, many of them ended up supporting Lula just now or remaining neutral because it's really just a group of opportunists stabbing each other in the back the whole time, And so on top of that, there's the power of executive order, of decrees, which is powerful in Brazil. When I talked about the affirmative action program that Lula pushed through initially, that the PT pushed through, I said 514, so I was off by 1. I'm sorry. That executive order, that was an executive order. It took 8 years after they issued the order to open up 52% of the spots in public universities to poor people before it was codified into law during the Dilma Rousseff administration. So he has a lot of things he can do without Congress. And then even with Congress, you look, centrists, MDB, of course. Yeah, so you look at the division here, right? 148 likely to support Bolsonaro, but open to negotiate. This is a good breakdown. I don't know where you got this, but I mean, these
S&P Global. The secret to get really good political analysis is to go to websites that are made for investors, because the investors, they cut through the BS because they just want to make money. So you don't get all the dumb propaganda. They just want to know the facts.
Yeah, well, if you look at this here, you see that you don't need all of the hand-wringing that I've seen going on by American so-called progressive or leftist journalists about what's going to happen in Congress. And this is basically what's going to happen in Congress, a lot of negotiation. And guess what? A lot of these parties that are negotiating are corrupt as hell. And so there's going to be more corruption. That doesn't mean that Lula's corrupt. It doesn't mean that the Workers' Party is corrupt. There'll probably be some Workers' Party elected officials who engage in active corruption as well, because it's a big party. But historically, it's been one of the least corrupt parties in Congress. Even at the height of all of that Lava Jato scandal, it was ranked 9th in terms of political parties with members, formally accused of or convicted of corruption. So there's going to be some corruption. It's not like this the big crippling issue that makes or breaks Brazil. It's more important to get these social policies pushed through, to get the industrial policies pushed through, to stimulate creation of new businesses and industries than to be, in my opinion, to be like 100% corruption free. I mean, because Lula won't be able to get anything done unless he gets support from some of these political parties that are historically corrupt. It's depressing, but that's just how you push things through sometimes. That doesn't mean that the partnership they make will be corrupt, but some of the people participating in these measures, voting in favor of measures Lula's trying to push through, will certainly have corruption problems. But that's it. I mean, the graphic's good. It shows that things are a lot more complex, that Bolsonaro didn't win control of Congress or the Senate. And he has a little bit more representation than the PT, but it's not the situation like probably the Biden administration is going to face next month if it loses which I think it will, lose control of Congress. It's not like the U.S. system. I mean, it's complicated. It's not, there's multiple parties. It's not just like, I feel like sometimes people look at Brazil from a U.S. lens. It's like, oh my God, PT didn't get 51% of Congress. It's like, well, nobody ever gets 51% of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, it's not helpful just to compare Brazil to the U.S. Now, there are some parallels, Bolsonaro, Trump, but obviously Lula is not comparable to any Democrat leader. Maybe you could say Bernie Sanders, but he's still way better than Bernie Sanders. So
Lula's actually done things, farther left than the things Bernie Sanders promises.
Yeah, exactly. But I know you have to run, Brian. I just wanted to kind of conclude here with, once again, a kind of overall view of what this means for the world. I'll just say again that for me, as someone who focuses on geopolitics and empire, I think Lula's victory really is a game changer, because under Lula, Brazil played such an important role in this attempt to build a multipolar world. In fact, Lula in 2020, he wrote an article at the Progressive International calling for a multipolar world. And if you look at the rhetoric of U.S. politicians, like, for instance, here's Trump's CIA director turned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. He boasted as recently as last year, 2021, he said, "Remember BRICS? Well, thanks to Jair Bolsonaro and Narendra Modi, Brazil and India both get that China and Russia are threats to their people." Now, this was, of course, a little premature, because we saw that for their own economic reasons, India and Brazil have been forced to continue to do a lot of trade with Russia and China. And that's not because of ideological reasons. It's simply because of economics. But the reality is that it shows that the U.S. government has been trying to sabotage BRICS by encouraging all of these internal divisions. And Lula is someone who, he's the master of diplomacy. And even though he's clearly on the left, he's very good at trying to win over politicians who don't necessarily agree with him on certain issues. And I think, for me, I mean, obviously for the people of Brazil who have been devastated by 6 years of neoliberalism and brutal social devastation, obviously for them, Lula's victory is going to mean something very, very significant. But I think for those of us who follow geopolitics, Lula's victory shows that U.S. hegemony is being contested around the world, and Latin America and the Caribbean play a very important part in this move toward a multipolar world. It's not just China and Russia and India and South Africa and Indonesia. I mean, Latin America and the Caribbean it's a separate pole, and that pole also happens to be the most progressive left-wing pole in the entire world. And I really think that the Latin American left is the international vanguard of the left. And that's why I want to thank you, Brian, for the indispensable work you always do on Brazil. People can follow Brian at Brazil Wire and at Telesur. You can see his Twitter handle is at Brian M. Telesur. Brian, is there anything else you want to plug before we conclude today?
No, just I want to plug happiness in Brazil. And let's hope that the impending coups attempts launched against Lula next year all fail.
Definitely. And the last note I'll end on is this is a map now. It's not a great map, as friend of the show Arancha Tirado showed in this tweet. It is a superficial representation. It ignores the very intense divisions inside the Latin American left. But in a superficial level, this map is useful. It shows all of the left-leaning governments in Latin America, and it's the vast majority. Now, really, the only right-wing exceptions are Guatemala, which could be short-lived because an indigenous-led left-wing movement is on the rise in Guatemala. In Ecuador, the right wing is in power, but I mean, the left is very powerful and is probably going to win the next election. In Paraguay and in Uruguay, there's also right-wing governments, but excluding them, most of the governments in the region are left-leaning. And in the largest countries, for the first time ever in the history of Latin America, because Colombia has never had a left-wing government until recently, for the first time, all of the large major populations in Latin America have left-wing governments, or at least left-leaning governments, despite the many internal divisions and contradictions. So this is a very historical moment, I think, for the region.
Let me just add that the population of those 4 blue countries is roughly equivalent to the greater Sao Paulo metropolitan area.
Exactly, and that's not to say those are insignificant.
Not to diminish the importance, and the people there, but I'm just saying in terms of, population living under left governments now.
Yeah, I mean, this is the first time in history that Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia have all had, and Argentina, although, the government there is not great and it's kind of on the verge of potentially losing power.
It's being couped. They're just trying to coup it constantly. I don't blame Alberto Fernandez for the problems in Argentina.
Yeah, exactly. So as with all of these situations, Peru also, Pedro Castillo is facing
Peru's kind
in lawfare. And,
then Chile, we don't really know what's going on with Chile because it's kind of there's signs as total, compatible NGO left type stuff.
Yeah. But the point is that, earlier we spent a lot of time talking about lawfare, legal warfare, judicial warfare against Lula. And that's the same thing we see against Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in Argentina. It's the same thing we see being used against Pedro Castillo in Peru to try to do a coup against him. So the right wing in all of these countries, the oligarchy is very powerful still and very vicious. But the point is that the left is ascendant, and Latin America continues to lead the world when it comes to the left and resisting imperialism. And I think now Brazil is going to have a rightful place in that struggle once again. And I want to thank you, Brian, for helping to explain all of these things that are happening in Brazil. For the 5th time, I'm just going to tell people they should go to Brazil Wire, because for me, it's been a very influential resource. The work that you all do at Brazil Wire is, of course, indispensable. And of course, Telesur as well. Telesur is one of the best media outlets. So thank you for the work that you do, Brian. Hopefully I'll have you get again soon to talk about the inauguration when Lula comes in a few months.
Yeah, and keep up the good work with Multipolarista. And you should come down to the inauguration January 1st. You should try and make it.
I hope I can.
All right.
I hope I can.
Take it easy, man. I really gotta fly now. So
yeah.
Literally flying to Recife in a few hours. So take it easy.
Brian.
Yep.
Yeah, and I want to thank all of the people who commented. There was a very vibrant discussion and a bit of a debate. I want to thank all the super chat comments. Teresa273, who recommended my interview on macro and cheese with Steve Grunbein. And yeah, that was a fun conversation. I talked about the geopolitical economy of the new Cold War, the economics of the new Cold War, and the neoliberal financialized system that the U.S. represents, as opposed to the Chinese socialist system. Also, Rich4, thanks to the super chat, and thanks to everyone else. There was hundreds and hundreds of comments. I always wish I could respond to these comments, but there are so many of them that it's actually impossible for me to respond to all of them. But I really am grateful. If you're watching on YouTube, please subscribe below, and this will be available as a podcast later. And if you want to support the show, I don't have any major sponsors. I don't have any big backers. You can go to youtube.com/multipolarista. And I'm going to continue doing coverage of imperialism and geopolitics. And I'll see you all next time. Thanks a lot.